Brookfield was the kind of town where people waved across porches, where kids rode their bikes past the corner store until the streetlights came on. But beneath its calm surface ran cracks filled with old wounds and whispered truths. Everyone knew them, but few dared speak them. Ezekiel Johnson, 72 years old, carried his groceries with slow, steady steps. A paper bag rustled in his hands, milk, bread, a jar of honey, nothing more. He was Grandpa Zeke to the children he once taught, a man who had dedicated decades to shaping young minds in a segregated school system. His back was slightly bent, but his dignity stood straight as a pillar. He paused at the corner, watching a group of teenagers play basketball under a flickering light. Their laughter warmed him. He thought, this is why I stayed in Brookfield, to see them grow in a place that still believes in tomorrow. But lurking just a block away, Officer Raymond Carter's patrol car prowled like a predator. To the department brass, Carter was a tough cop, a man who didn't hesitate. To the black community, he was a storm cloud that never passed. His record was littered with complaints, harassment, unnecessary stops, verbal abuse. But complaints vanished in paperwork drawers, and Carter's swagger only grew. That night, when his headlights fell on Ezekiel's frame, something ugly twisted in his grin. The squad car screeched to a halt. Tires screamed against pavement. The sound sliced through the laughter on the basketball court. Children froze. Hey! Carter's voice cracked the air like a whip. He slammed his door shut, hand hovering over his holster. His boots thudded on the asphalt as he approached. What have you got there, old man? Huh? Ezekiel turned, surprised, his grip tightening on the bag. Groceries, he said simply, voice calm, steady. Carter smirked, circling him like prey. Groceries? That what we're calling it now? You people are always up to something. Let's see what you stole this time. The insult wasn't new to Ezekiel. He had lived through marches, slurs, fire hoses, and nights when the world seemed determined to crush him. But he had also lived through victories, students who grew up to be doctors, lawyers, mothers, fathers. That strength steadied him now. I've stolen nothing, Ezekiel said, adjusting his bag carefully. Just bread, milk, and honey. His voice was not pleading. It was simply truth. Carter's eyes narrowed. The lack of fear enraged him. He stepped closer, lowering his tone so only Ezekiel could hear. Don't play smart with me. I know your type. You walk these streets like you own them. But I'll remind you who's in charge. Behind him, a small crowd began to gather. Neighbors peeked from porches. A mother tugged her child back inside. Phones flickered to life, screens raised, recording. The night grew tense. Carter jabbed a finger toward the ground. On your knees. Now. The words cut through the air, sharp as a blade. Gasps rose from the crowd. Ezekiel's eyes held his, unwavering. His voice carried the weight of every year he had lived, every injustice he had endured without breaking. I will not kneel. Not for you. Not for anyone who sees me as less than a man. The silence after those words was deafening. Carter's face darkened, a vein pulsing at his temple. His hand yanked the gun free, barrel flashing under the streetlight. He aimed it square at Ezekiel's chest. For a moment, time fractured. The world held its breath. Mothers pulled children close. Teenagers lowered their basketballs, eyes wide. A baby cried in the distance, its wail echoing against the concrete. But Ezekiel did not flinch. His heart pounded, yes, but not from fear, from defiance, from memory, from the unshakable truth that dignity could never be forced to its knees. Have you ever been judged unfairly just because of how you look, where you're from, or what someone assumed about you? Drop a heart if you've felt that sting. Because what's about to happen next will show you why standing tall, literally, can change everything. The streetlight above hummed, its glow casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. The barrel of Carter's gun gleamed, catching every flicker of light. His hand was steady, but his eyes, wild, restless, betrayed the fury simmering inside. On your knees. Carter barked again, louder this time, as though sheer force could bend reality to his will. But Ezekiel Johnson did not move. His grip remained tight around the grocery bag. The carton of milk trembled slightly, though not from fear. Age and strain worked their claim on his hands. Still, his back was straight, his eyes fixed on Carter with quiet defiance. I told you, Officer Ezekiel said, his voice even, firm. I will not kneel. Not to hate. Not tonight. The crowd rippled with murmurs. Phones tilted higher, capturing the confrontation from every angle. Whispers of he's just an old man and what's he doing, threaded through the air. Carter, aware of the growing audience, puffed up his chest. This was his theater now. His uniform, his badge, his gun, all of it was power he believed untouchable. You think these people care about you? He sneered, sweeping the gun's muzzle toward the crowd. They'll watch you fall and go back inside. Nobody's coming to save you, old man. Ezekiel inhaled slowly. The weight of history pressed on his chest, but so too did the unshakable truth that dignity was not a gift to be given or taken, it was a right he carried within. "I don't need saving," he said. "Not from you." The words sliced deeper than Carter expected. His jaw clenched, rage spilling over. "You're nothing but a stubborn relic, still thinking you can talk back. I'll make you an example." Gasps erupted as Carter shoved the gun closer, pressing the barrel mere inches from Ezekiel's heart. Somewhere in the crowd, a boy whispered, "Mama, why's he doing that to Mr. Zeke?" The mother pulled him close, shushing him, her eyes glassy with fear. No one stepped forward. No one dared. Silent witnesses stood frozen, neighbors, friends, strangers, all too aware of the cost of interfering. It was easier to film, easier to whisper, than to act. Carter's smirk returned, feeding off the paralysis around him. "See," he said, voice dripping with venom, "even your people won't help you. They know better." Ezekiel swallowed, pain tightening his throat, not from fear of death, but from the sight of his community, once so vibrant with courage, now shackled by fear. He could not blame them. He had taught them history. He knew the cost of standing up, yet he also knew the cost of silence. "You think you're the law," Ezekiel said softly, "but law without justice is nothing more than tyranny." The crowd stirred. Words carried, echoing beyond the moment. Phones zoomed in closer. Carter's face twisted, his ego rattled by the quiet challenge. "Don't preach to me, old man. You're one word away from..." He tapped the trigger with his finger, a silent threat. Ezekiel raised his chin. His voice did not rise in anger but carried steady like a hymn. "I've faced worse than you. I've stood in the face of fire hoses, dogs, and men who thought their hate would last forever. But look at me, I am still here, and I will not bow." For a heartbeat, silence fell again. Even Carter's breath hitched. Something about the words unsettled him, something that reminded him he wasn't as invincible as he pretended. But pride is a cruel master. He barked a bitter laugh. "You're nothing but an old fool. You should have learned when to shut your mouth." Carter reached forward, grabbing at Ezekiel's arm, yanking the bag of groceries. The paper tore. A loaf of bread tumbled out, bouncing on the pavement. Milk splashed across the asphalt, spreading like a pale shadow. The humiliation stung sharper than the gun's threat. Gasps turned to angry murmurs in the crowd. A woman shouted, "That's enough." But no one moved closer. Ezekiel looked down at the spilled food, then back at Carter. His eyes, glistening with sorrow, held a strange calm. "You can spill my milk, officer, but you cannot spill my dignity." The line landed heavy. Phones caught it. Hearts absorbed it. Carter's smirk faltered. For the first time, the weight of the crowd seemed less like an audience and more like witnesses to his downfall. Still, his pride clawed at him, demanding he push further. "Last chance," he hissed. "On your knees, or I'll put you there myself." The street was electric now, buzzing with tension. Every bystander knew something irreversible was about to happen. Right now, what would you do? Would you stay silent, step in, or record from the sidelines? Be honest in the comments, because in moments like this, silence has a cost, and action carries risk. What would you choose? The scene froze on a knife's edge. Ezekiel unbowed, Carter seething, the crowd torn between fear and fury. And somewhere in the distance, faint but growing louder, the roar of another engine approached. The crowd's murmur swelled, a nervous hum rolling through the night. Carter stood tall in his false confidence, finger grazing the trigger, savoring the control he thought was his. Ezekiel, unbent, unbroken, stared back with the kind of defiance born not of rage, but of resilience. Then, screech. Tires shrieked against the asphalt, rubber burning, the echo bouncing off brick walls. A black SUV tore into view, lights cutting through the tense standoff. Gasps rippled across the street. Heads turned. Phones pivoted. The driver's door flung open. Out stepped Police Chief Harold Daniels. His frame was solid, his stride deliberate, his jaw set like stone. Daniels was known throughout Brookfield, not perfect, no man was, but respected for one thing above all else, fairness. He had risen through a system marred by prejudice, yet never surrendered to its rot. And now, in this moment, his eyes burned with fury. "Raymond." Daniels' voice cracked like thunder. It was not a question. It was not a greeting. It was judgment. Carter flinched, his grip faltering for a split second before tightening again. His eyes darted between the crowd, the gun, and his chief. He forced a shaky laugh. "Chief," he was resisting. "You don't understand. These people..." "Stop," Daniels barked, striding closer. Each step was a hammer pounding into Carter's crumbling facade. "Do you hear yourself? Do you even see what you're doing?" The crowd stirred, energy shifting. For the first time, hope flickered. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Daniels' every word. Carter's mask began to slip. "He wouldn't comply, Chief. I told him to kneel." "Kneel." Daniels cut him off, voice sharp with disgust. You told a 72-year-old man to kneel. The word hung heavy, dripping with history, with memory. It wasn't just about Ezekiel. It was about generations forced to bend. Daniels stepped between Carter and Ezekiel, planting himself like a shield. The barrel of Carter's gun wavered, the authority behind it dissolving. Put it down, Daniels commanded. His tone left no room for choice. Carter hesitated, his pride fighting against the inevitable. Sweat trickled down his temple. He glanced at the crowd, realizing their eyes were no longer afraid of him, they were condemning him. Chief, I was just. You were disgracing this badge, Daniels snapped. His hand shot forward, seizing the metal emblem pinned to Carter's chest. With one fierce motion, he ripped it free. The metallic clink echoed as the badge hit the ground, rolling once before lying still in the dirt. The crowd erupted, some gasping, some shouting, some crying. The symbolic weight of that act was undeniable. A man stripped of authority in front of the very community he had terrorized. Ezekiel inhaled deeply, relief washing over him, though his stance remained steady. He had not fought for vengeance, he had stood for dignity. But now, dignity was being defended, not just by him, but by someone in power. Daniel's voice shook with controlled fury. This uniform is not a weapon for your hate. It is not a shield for your prejudice. You will never wear it again. Carter's mouth opened, searching for words, but only silence came. His power, once absolute, had evaporated before his eyes. The gun hung limply in his hand. Finally, with trembling fingers, he lowered it. Phones recorded every second, the badge in the dirt, Carter's crumbling posture, Ezekiel's unbroken silhouette standing behind Daniels. The story had already left the street. It was flying into homes, timelines, and hearts across the nation. Ezekiel spoke then, his voice quiet but carrying across the tense silence. You see, Officer Carter, you thought you had power. But true power does not come from a gun or a badge. True power is standing in truth, even when hate demands you bow. The crowd roared with approval. Some shouted amen. Others clapped. Tears streaked cheeks. It wasn't just about one old man anymore. It was about every injustice endured in silence, every humiliation swallowed. Carter staggered back, the reality crashing down. His arrogance melted into fear, not of Ezekiel, not even of Daniels, but of the truth. The truth that the world had witnessed his hate, and there would be no hiding now. Daniels turned, placing a steady hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. Mr. Johnson, I am so sorry. You should never have faced this. Not in my town, not on my watch. Ezekiel nodded once, his face etched with both weariness and resolve. The apology is yours to carry, Chief. My dignity was never his to take. The badge lay in the gutter, glinting faintly under the flickering streetlight. Carter stared at it as though it were a lifeline slipping away, his mouth half open, his authority unraveling with each heartbeat. Chief Daniels stood between him and Ezekiel, every inch of his frame radiating command. The crowd surged forward slightly, no longer shrinking in fear but leaning into the moment, voices rising. Justice. Someone shouted. Fire him. Another cried. Phones captured everything, the sound, the faces, the trembling hand that still clutched Carter's gun. Drop it, Daniels ordered, voice firm. Carter hesitated, chest heaving. The man who once lorded over Brookfield's black community with unchecked arrogance now looked cornered, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He glanced at the crowd, faces he'd dismissed, belittled, harassed. Now they stared at him with a mixture of fury and vindication. Slowly, Carter lowered the gun. The metal clattered against the pavement. The sound echoed like a verdict. Two uniformed officers, drawn by the commotion, pushed through the crowd. They froze when they saw their chief, saw Carter, saw Ezekiel standing tall. Daniels didn't hesitate. Take his weapon. Escort him to the station. He's under review effective immediately. Chief, one officer started, uneasy. Now, Daniels thundered. Reluctantly, they obeyed. Carter's wrists were seized, his weapon confiscated. The man who once strutted through these streets as untouchable now stumbled, shackled by his own disgrace. The crowd erupted, cheers, sobs, prayers. Some people hugged, others simply exhaled the breath they'd been holding. For once, they had witnessed accountability in real time. Ezekiel, though shaken, remained composed. His hands were empty now, groceries spilled at his feet. Daniels bent down, picking up the loaf of bread, brushing the dirt away before handing it back. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. I wish I could undo this night, Daniels said quietly, his voice carrying enough for those nearby to hear. But I can promise you this, his actions will not be buried. Not this time. Ezekiel took the bread, his hand trembling slightly. His voice, however, was steady. Promises are words, Chief. Brookfield has heard many words. What matters is what follows. The statement hung in the air, undeniable. Daniels nodded, accepting the rebuke not as insult but as truth. Behind them, Carter spat bitterly. You will regret this, Chief. You can't make them love you. They'll turn on you too. Daniels turned, his face hard as granite. This isn't about being loved, Raymond. This is about being right. And tonight, you showed us all who you really are. The crowd roared its approval. Carter shrank further, his voice drowned by the noise. But amid the celebration, Ezekiel scanned the faces around him. Relief was there, yes. But so was something else: questions, doubt, wounds deeper than one officer's hate. The problem wasn't just Carter. He was a symptom. The disease ran wider. Phones streamed live. Within minutes, the video was climbing across social media. Hashtags spread. News alerts pinged across screens. What happened on this street corner was no longer just Brookfield's secret, it was the world's witness. A reporter, breathless from rushing to the scene, pushed through with a microphone. "Chief Daniels, what just happened here tonight? Can you comment?" Daniels straightened, his voice carrying over the crowd. "What happened is unacceptable. No man, especially not one entrusted with this uniform, has the right to degrade, humiliate, or endanger a citizen based on prejudice. Officer Carter's behavior is not policing, it is hate. And it ends tonight." The soundbite traveled instantly, shared and replayed. But Ezekiel, listening, knew the story was still fragile. Words could inspire, but systems had a way of protecting themselves. He spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise. "Chief Daniels, one badge may be gone tonight. But what about the others? What about the ones who turned their heads, who closed the files, who let him walk these streets with his hate unchecked? What about the silence that made this possible?" The crowd hushed, hanging on every word. Daniels faced him, expression tight. This wasn't just a confrontation between an officer and his chief. It was the mirror of an entire institution being forced to see itself. "You're right," Daniels admitted, his tone grave. "This isn't just about Carter. This is about us. About the culture we've allowed. And I will answer for it." The admission was raw, unexpected. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. For the first time that night, Ezekiel's stern gaze softened just slightly. "Then maybe," he said, "Brookfield still has a chance." The night of Carter's disgrace did not end on that street corner. By morning, the video had spread far beyond Brookfield. News anchors dissected the footage frame by frame. Headlines blared. "Officer pulls gun on elderly black man, stripped of badge by chief on scene." Talk shows debated it. Churches prayed over it. Schools buzzed with whispers. Brookfield, once a quiet town known for its stillness, was now a national symbol of reckoning. But the true test was not viral outrage. It was what Brookfield would do next. City Hall called an emergency meeting. The mayor, shaken by the storm of attention, announced a full internal investigation into the police department. A commission was formed: community leaders, civil rights attorneys, clergy, and yes, even teenagers who had filmed the event. Ezekiel was invited to testify. He entered the courthouse with his head held high, wearing the same brown jacket he'd worn the night of the incident. The bag of groceries, once spilled on the pavement, had been carefully replaced by his neighbors, a symbolic gesture that reminded him he did not walk alone. The chamber was packed. Journalists lined the walls. Cameras clicked. The air carried a heaviness, the weight of history pressing against the room's wooden panels. When asked to speak, Ezekiel rose slowly. His voice was quiet at first, but steady, building with each word. "I am not here tonight for vengeance," he began. "I am here for truth. One officer pulled a gun on me, yes, but the greater crime was the silence that allowed him to believe he could. How many complaints were dismissed? How many voices ignored? How many men in uniform looked away?" The room was silent except for the scratching of pens and the hum of recording equipment. Ezekiel's words carried the weight of decades, slicing through defensiveness and excuses. "This is not just about me," he continued. "It is about every young man stopped for walking home. Every mother who fears the knock on her door. Every elder forced to lower his eyes to survive another day. The question before you is not whether Carter was wrong. That is plain. The question is whether Brookfield has the courage to admit that the system that empowered him was wrong too." His words landed like thunder. The audience erupted. Applause, shouts of agreement, tears. Chief Daniels followed. His uniform looked heavier than usual, his shoulders burdened by guilt. He did not defend Carter. Instead, he admitted his own failures. "I let reports vanish into drawers. I let politics outweigh conscience. I told myself one officer couldn't define a department. But silence defines us as much as action. And my silence gave him cover." Gasps rippled through the room. A chief admitting fault was unheard of. But Daniels pressed on. "I accept responsibility, and I commit, before this community, to change not only policy but culture. Because a culture that tolerates hate is no culture at all." The commission's work stretched for weeks. Testimonies piled up. Citizens spoke of stops for driving while black, of insults, of nights spent in holding cells for crimes that didn't exist. Files long buried were unearthed. Patterns emerged. Carter was not an exception. He was a symptom. Reforms were rolled out, not as promises, but as policy. A civilian oversight board with power to review complaints independently. Mandatory body cameras, with footage released in cases of misconduct. Bias and de-escalation training for every officer, tied directly to performance reviews. Community patrol partnerships, where officers walk neighborhoods unarmed to build trust instead of fear. Transparency requirements, ensuring that disciplinary records could not be hidden. Brookfield Police Department was being rebuilt in public view, every step documented, every promise measured. Through it all, Ezekiel remained steady. He did not seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway. Students from his old classrooms came to see him speak. Some brought children of their own, whispering, "That's the man who taught me to never bow to hate." In interviews, Ezekiel never spoke of himself as a hero. He always redirected the light. "I stood because I could not kneel," he told one reporter. "But the real story is not about me. It's about whether this town will stand, or keep bowing to silence." His humility only deepened the respect he received. He became the quiet conscience of the reform effort, a reminder that justice wasn't just a policy, but a practice. Brookfield changed in ways large and small. Patrol cars no longer prowled like predators but slowed to wave at children. Officers walked in pairs, greeting shop owners, checking in on elders. Complaints that once disappeared were now logged, tracked, and answered. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But the cracks in Brookfield's silence were finally being filled with courage instead of fear. And Carter? His name became a cautionary tale. His trial drew headlines, his conviction etched into the town's history as the day hate lost its badge. Ezekiel did not attend the sentencing. He was tending to his garden that morning, pulling weeds with the same patience he once used to guide children through math problems. When asked later why he hadn't gone, he said simply, "I had no weeds left to pull in that courtroom." Brookfield was pulling its own. Months passed. Brookfield no longer lived in the shadow of Carter's gun. The reforms had taken root, but something deeper was stirring, a yearning that stretched beyond policies and procedures. The video of that night had never stopped circulating. It became part of documentaries, college lectures, and Sunday sermons. Activists cited it as proof that communities could demand justice and win. Politicians used it as a case study when debating national police reform. But the most profound changes were quieter. In classrooms, children role-played the moment when Chief Daniels ripped the badge from Carter's chest, reenacting it not as a spectacle of shame, but as a parable of courage. Teachers asked, "What would you do if you saw injustice?" In homes, parents reminded their children that Ezekiel stood firm not with fists, but with dignity. The story became a compass, pointing toward courage without violence. Though Ezekiel never sought leadership, leadership found him. Invitations poured in, from universities, from civil rights groups, from city councils. He declined most of them, preferring the quiet rhythms of his garden and the company of his neighbors. But when he did speak, people listened. His voice carried the authority of someone who had lived long enough to see cycles repeat, and dared to break one. At a town hall in a neighboring city, he told the audience, "Justice is not a destination, it is a direction. We do not arrive at it once and stop. We work toward it every day. And when we stop walking, injustice overtakes us again." The room, filled with people of every age and color, rose to its feet. Some wept, others simply nodded, as if finally hearing words they had long carried but never spoken. Chief Daniels, too, was changed. He no longer spoke like a man guarding an institution but like one serving it. He invited the Civilian Oversight Board to his own office, sitting with them as equals. He started a youth mentorship program, pairing officers with at-risk teens, not to watch them, but to guide them. One afternoon, Daniels and Ezekiel were spotted walking together down Main Street. They paused at the very corner where the gun had once been drawn. Daniels looked at the spot in silence. Ezekiel, sensing his heaviness, said, "That corner no longer belongs to fear. It belongs to change." Daniels nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. For a man who had spent decades behind a badge, that corner was his greatest confession, and his deepest redemption. The yearning for change did not end in Brookfield. Other towns began forming their own oversight boards, citing Brookfield as inspiration. Police academies revised training manuals, inserting case studies about dignity, restraint, and the danger of unchecked bias. Journalists nicknamed it the Brookfield Shift. The federal government took notice. Hearings on police reform opened in Congress, and Ezekiel's testimony was requested. He declined politely, writing instead a simple letter that was read aloud on the Senate floor. The question before this nation is not whether one officer can be held accountable, but whether a system can hold itself accountable. Until the answer is yes, justice remains unfinished. The chamber fell silent after the reading. Some lawmakers called it one of the most powerful testimonies ever given without a voice in the room. But the deepest yearning showed itself in the young. Ezekiel's own grandniece, Layla, a fiery high school senior, decided to study law. "I want to fight for people the way Uncle Zeke stood that night," she told her teacher. She wasn't alone. Dozens of students across Brookfield applied for law, social work, or criminal justice programs, citing that night as their reason. Even children too young to remember the details understood the lesson. On playgrounds, when disputes broke out, some mimicked Daniel's ripping Carter's badge, shouting, "No more bullies." It became shorthand for standing up against unfairness. Ezekiel often sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the street where the world had nearly ended for him. The grocer across the street always waved, sometimes leaving a bag of apples by his door. Teenagers stopped by to ask him questions about life, about courage, about fear. One asked, "Weren't you scared that night?" Ezekiel chuckled softly. "Son, being scared is not the enemy. Bowing to fear is." As the sun dipped low, Ezekiel thought often about the strange arc of his life. He had been a teacher, a quiet man, never famous, never seeking attention. Yet in one terrible moment, the years of patience, the decades of endurance, and the weight of history itself had all converged on his shoulders. He bore it not for glory, but for survival. And in surviving with dignity, he had given others a map. Brookfield was still not perfect. Racism did not vanish overnight. Missteps still happened. But the difference was this: silence was no longer an option. The town had been awakened, and the yearning for change could not be lulled back to sleep. Ezekiel knew he would not live to see the full fruit of this movement. But he no longer needed to. For the first time in his long life, he saw young people carrying the torch with steady hands. One evening, as he watered his garden, a young girl passed by, humming softly. She stopped at his fence and said, "Mr. Ezekiel, my mama told me you're the reason I don't have to be afraid of the police anymore." Ezekiel's throat tightened. He bent down, plucked a small sunflower from his garden, and handed it to her. "Then promise me, child," he said, "that you will never let anyone plant fear in your soil again." The girl nodded solemnly, clutching the flower like a treasure. In that moment, Ezekiel realized the yearning for change was not his alone. It had taken root in a new generation, and it would keep growing long after his time. The story of Brookfield could have ended on that corner, the flash of a gun, the gasp of a crowd, the shattering of a community. But it didn't. It ended, instead, with something far stronger than fear: dignity. Injustice wears many uniforms. Sometimes it looks like a badge, sometimes like a law, sometimes like silence in the face of cruelty. But dignity has only one face. It is the face of a man standing tall even when the world demands he bow. It is the face of neighbors who refuse to look away. It is the face of leaders who choose courage over complicity. Ezekiel Johnson never asked to become a symbol, yet his refusal to kneel became a lesson written into the conscience of a community, then a nation. It taught that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I will not kneel." That whisper carried across streets, across state lines, across generations. And now, that whisper reaches us. Because this story is not just about Brookfield, or Ezekiel, or Chief Daniels, or even Carter's disgrace. It is about us, the choices we make when faced with injustice in our own lives. Will we look away? Will we excuse it? Or will we stand, like Ezekiel, with dignity? The struggle for justice is not a single battle but a lifelong journey. Even in the wake of reform, new challenges rise. Prejudice mutates, systems resist, and fear whispers again. But the people of Brookfield showed that vigilance, courage, and unity can bend the arc of history closer to justice. Ezekiel often said, "Justice is not a finish line, it's a road we must walk every day." That road stretches before us now. Where it leads depends on whether we have the courage to walk it. I was 72 years old when I looked into the eyes of hate and chose not to bow. Not because I was brave, but because I was tired of bending my back to prejudice. That night taught me something: dignity is the one thing no man can take from you unless you give it away. So guard it, live it, and when your moment comes, stand tall. The camera pans upward, showing the street corner where it all began. Children now play there, chalk drawings covering the pavement, sunflowers, hearts, the words "never again." Music swells, hopeful, triumphant.